The case against Bryan Kohberger is something that we've been covering for quite some time since the tragedy took place in November of 2022 in Moscow, Idaho. If you've been listening to the podcast for any period of time, you know how invested we have been in this case. And there's a lot of questions that still remain as we inch closer and closer to that trial date for Bryan Kohberger with the accusations against him, first-degree murder of those 4 college students. Joining me right now is author J. Ruben Appleman. He has written the book, or a book on it. I shouldn't say the book. There's been a couple books on this thus far, but you've really taken a big, deep dive into this. It's called While Idaho Slept. I want to ask you first, this obviously, it's a compelling case without a doubt. What first brought you into the finding interest in this and wanting to take it further than just being, someone watching and spectating on the case from a distance?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me on the thing. But also, you mentioned a couple of books before this. I'm not sure what you're talking about. If you're talking about books that are proposed, that's a possibility. But I don't know of any other books. But that said, I don't really chase true crime. It's not really my thing in terms of like my personal life. Like it's dark for me to be absorbed by that stuff on a daily basis. But I do chase stories that matter to me. And so that's how I got involved with this case. The first book I wrote, The Kill Jar, four kids were abducted and killed in the area around my home in Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up in the 1970s. And I wrote, and that case was allegedly unsolved. And I spent 10 years researching that case and wrote a book about it because it mattered to me. Sure. I didn't go off right after that and do another true crime book or anything like that. But then this thing happened again in my new backyard, so to speak. I've been in Idaho for 25 years, almost 23 years, and many connections to the University of Idaho. Many people I know have friends children who are students there. Many of my friends went there. One of my children went to the University of Idaho. I know professors there. I know people that live in that community. And as a private investigator, I actually have worked up there in North Idaho several times on cases. And so I know the area, I know the people. And when this story broke, sure, I was captivated like everybody else by some of the details that are just horrific, but more so I was sort of compelled to go up there just the way a neighbor would go check out what's going on at the end of the block, like who got killed up there, what happened, and you want to go and feel it out if you're a community member and go, what, how can I help or something, Sure. And even if you have no guideposts toward how to do that, I like to say that writers are first responders. We don't, carry a badge. We don't carry a medical kit, but we do our own thing. And sometimes that's a good way to help. Go up there, figure out if there's a story to be told and try to tell that story if it's compelling to you enough or if it feels like something that you need to be a part of. I had no way of knowing that I would really write this book. I just kind of went up there because it happened and I felt compelled to be around it. And I certainly didn't want to be a tourist in the area, so to speak. I say a tourist in other people's suffering. That's not what I want it to be. And that's not what I came away with. After being up there for a little while, I was like, there's going to be people that write this book. And I'd like to be the first person to be able to do it because I'm an Idahoan, because I know the area. There were a lot of East Coast people and West Coast people parachuting in, trying to get a piece of the case, so to speak. I was not that type of person. I was there because I wanted to commune, in a way. Like I wanted to be a part of it in a spiritual way. I wanted to be an honest, ethical voice for whatever was happening. So it felt right to be the guy that go there and do that.
It's a story that is still obviously being told as we learn more and more about this case, and we will obviously continue to learn more as the accusations and all of that continue to be worked through. Tell me at the beginning of all of this, before we even knew the name Bryan Kohberger as being the main suspect here and the accused of the murders, what was your mindset? Because at the beginning of all of this, it was chaos, it seemed. There were looking for this white Elantra. There was a lot of criticism against the police department at that moment in time, claims of them being incompetent, this and that. Turns out they knew a heck of a lot more than we all did all along and actually were keeping their cards close to the vest. They weren't just, being derelict in their duty by any means. They really found some information out very quickly and kept it close enough to make an arrest. Tell me about that point in time when you're just beginning to learn about the story. And I guess, how were you going about documenting it? Did you have any idea that it was going to turn into a book? Or you're trying to find a way to share this experience, especially being a local, with others from a different perspective than just here's a horrible murder and here comes the reporter.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions in there. I like that you brought up the police when you mentioned that there was a lot of chatter in mainstream media about and in social media about, oh, the cops are blowing this, they're too small, they're podunk, they're whatever that. They were compared at times to that old black and white TV show with the two cops. I can't remember their names, but in the 1950s, just kind of small town, local yokel, sort of whatever people were trying to call the Moscow Police Department.
Yeah.
And that it's interesting that I found myself defending them, because my first book, The Kill Jar, half the book is about the poor performance of the police in the case that I was following previously. And because that was the truth of the story, that the police had buried evidence, that they had covered up leads, that they had done everything they possibly could to not let the case point back at this wealthy young man who was involved in the murders of these kids in Detroit. Okay, so I called all that out. Now, this next case, people are starting to call out the police department, and you would think that I would be somebody who would have a penchant. If you only knew me from my writing,
sure,
that I would be somebody who had a penchant for calling out the police. Well, I have a penchant for telling the truth. And in this case, none of it made sense to me. I could see Chief Fry and the local police department in Moscow doing everything they possibly could to give as much information as they could without sacrificing that information to the hyenas for no good reason. Police are supposed to hold on to evidence. They're not supposed to show all their cards to the press. They're not. People like you and I, we want information. That's how we function.
Yeah.
But it's not their job to give us that information, right? And there are a lot of arguments about freedom of speech and freedom of the press and all this stuff. Well, sure, all those things exist, absolutely, but it's not the police department's job to give up information without going through proper channels to get that information. And I think in light of that, or I think in regardless of that, Fry and the Moscow Police Department gave up a ton of information. They gave constant updates on their website. They held press conferences. They spoke to the media. They didn't have to do any of that.
Sure.
They didn't have to do any of that, right? So I think they did a really good job of providing information. What happened was they would talk to the press and then not really give the details the press wanted. So the press, like people overseas, everywhere were saying, oh, these people are going to flub the investigation. Well, from the very early days, the Moscow PD called in the state police and the FBI. Idaho is a small state, but we have a state police department, right? We have murders here, right? We have violent crimes. We have people who are trained in homicide investigations. Whether or not Moscow sees a lot of homicides is irrelevant. We had the state police and we had the feds, so, and they were all working together, and with many people on the ground, asking the right questions, doing the right things, following trails of evidence and such. When there was nothing to know at first in the public, when I went up there, I rented a motel room and I just kind of loitered around, I don't come with a big lighting kit and a microphone and 4 people in a rented $200 a day Chevy Tahoe blacked out, parked in the neighbors' parking spaces, which is what a lot of the mainstream media did. And they showed up with a bunch of people in coats that nobody wears up in North Idaho, with hairdos that nobody has, with manicures that nobody gets, and I'm not picking on people from big cities. I'm saying they stood out like a sore thumb. That's all. Mm-hmm. I love city life. If I could find a way to live back in Detroit sometimes, I probably would sometimes, right? Mm-hmm. I like the city stuff, but it was very clear that city slickers had showed up trying to get the scoop. And I do not appear as that when I was up there. I was up there in my Carhartts and my 15-year-old flannel and just talking to people. And I did not know that I would write a book. After a while, I thought I should tell this story. I was actually midway through my book proposal, which is how you get a nonfiction book deal. You get a proposal to the publishers. And I was midway through that when they announced the arrest of Bryan Kohberger. So I didn't have any information about Kohberger when I was starting to write the proposal for the book. I finished it up pretty quick. HarperCollins, the publisher, I had many people throwing proposals at them to write this story. They were bigger names than I am. They were more credentialed in many ways in terms of like, oh, they went to J school here, journalism school here or there, or they had, written about some other big case or whatever. But my publisher, HarperCollins, wanted a local person. Mm-hmm. And in the state of Idaho, I'm one of only a couple of people who are writing in this genre who have some sort of pedigree in investigations. I've been a private investigator for 10 years. My last book was turned into that TV show, Children of the Snow. It was on Hulu for many years. And so I had the pedigree to an extent. I'm not a New York Times reporter, but they had those people wanting to write the book. Instead, they asked me to write it. Mm-hmm. And I was very happy that happened, only because a local person could then tell the story. And what I've been getting from the comments people have made is that the picture of North Idaho has been painted very well. The people have been painted very well. There's an enormous amount of respect for the police department and the people in North Idaho, for the families of the victims, for the victims themselves. And I'm very happy that's been the response.
Sick of the ads?
We are too.
Start listening with no commercials now and get access to all of our episodes in advance of everyone else.
Become a True Crime Today Premium Plus subscriber on Apple Podcasts.
Search True Crime Today Premium Plus on Apple Podcasts or go to our podcast page and sign up now.
True Crime Today Premium Plus.
Sign up now.